My name is Paige, and I was 34 years old when my father slid a stack of papers across his kitchen table and told me to sign away everything I'd built, or stop calling myself his daughter. The pen was already uncapped. He'd even circled the line for my signature in red ink, like I was a child who needed help finding where to write my name. But here's what my father didn't know. What I did next is why you're here. Welcome back to Home of Secrets, where every house has a secret room, and the woman they forgot about has had the key the whole time. If you are new here, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know. This story is only just beginning. I grew up in Cedar Hollow, Maine. Population 2,840. Give or take whoever was born or buried that year. We had one diner, the Maple Fork, where the coffee was always burnt by 10 a.m., and nobody minded. We had one church, First Lutheran, white clapboard, bell that rang 4 minutes slow for as long as anyone could remember. We had one stoplight, and it blinked yellow after 9 at night, like the whole town agreed there was nothing left to regulate once the sun went down. The house I grew up in smelled like pipe tobacco and lemon furniture polish, a combination so specific that I still can't walk past a hardware store without my chest tightening. My father, Robert Whitfield, built furniture for 41 years out of a workshop behind the house, and later turned that workshop into Whitfield Casework, a company that made custom cabinetry for half the kitchens in 3 counties. By the time I was in high school, he had 11 employees, and a reputation for showing up to deliveries himself, shaking hands, remembering names. People respected him. I respected him too, for a long time. My mother died when I was 9. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral. After that, it was just the 3 of us, my father, my older brother Dale, and me. Dale was the favorite, and nobody pretended otherwise. He was 4 years older, loud the way my father used to be loud before grief quieted him down, and he had a talent for being forgiven. Dale wrecked the company truck twice before he turned 20. Dale dropped out of community college after 1 semester to find himself, which mostly meant finding the inside of the Maple Fork bar at 2 in the afternoon. Dale was, by every measure that mattered to my father, the future of Whitfield Casework. He just didn't do any of the work that might have made that true. I did the work. I started doing the books for my father's company when I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a ledger, because he said I had a head for numbers, the way some people have a head for music. By 19, I was reconciling invoices on weekends, while I went to community college for accounting during the week. By 23, I had my CPA license and a job at a regional accounting firm 2 towns over, and I was still doing my father's quarterly taxes for free every April, because that's what you do for family, or that's what I believed back then. My father never once, in all those years, called me capable. He called me good with paperwork. He called me reliable. Those are not compliments when you say them the way he said them, flat, a little dismissive, the way you describe a filing cabinet. Dale, who couldn't balance a checkbook, got called a natural leader at every Thanksgiving table for a decade. The one person who saw it clearly was my grandfather, my father's own father, Walter Whitfield. He was 81 the year this story really starts, still sharp, still living alone in the house at the edge of town where my father grew up. Walter had been the one who lent my father the $11,000 in 1981 to buy his first table saw and his first set of clamps. Walter had been, in a real sense, the very first investor in Whitfield Casework, though nobody but Walter and a faded ledger entry remembered that anymore. "You're the one who actually runs that place," Walter told me once, on his porch, the summer I turned 26. "Your father just signs the checks you write." I didn't understand yet how true that would become. I just nodded and ate my pie and drove home in the dark, the porch light shrinking in my rearview mirror, like something I was leaving behind a little more each year. The slow betrayal started in small ways, the way most of them do. It rarely starts with a single dramatic blow. It starts with 100 quiet ones, each small enough to forgive on its own. When I was 28, my father asked me to come on as the company's controller, officially, with a real title and a real salary, instead of the under-the-table arrangement we'd had for years. I said yes immediately. I believed, foolishly, that this meant something had finally shifted, that he saw what I'd built into that business, brick by brick, spreadsheet by spreadsheet. What it actually meant was that he needed someone to clean up a mess Dale had made. Dale, at 32, had talked my father into letting him handle vendor relationships, which mostly meant Dale negotiated handshake deals with suppliers that existed nowhere on paper, then forgot the terms 3 weeks later. In my first 4 months as controller, I found $34,000 in unbilled materials, 2 vendor accounts that hadn't been reconciled in 14 months, and 1 supplier who was quietly charging us 11% more than our competitors, because nobody had renegotiated the contract since 2009. I fixed all of it, quietly. I didn't go to my father with a complaint about Dale. I went to him with a binder, color-coded, tabbed, 22 pages, showing exactly where the money had gone, and exactly how I'd recovered $19,400 of it within the first 90 days. My father flipped through it for 40 seconds. 40 seconds, I counted, because I was watching his face the whole time, waiting for something. Then he closed the binder and said, "Good. Make sure your brother doesn't feel like he's being audited." Not "thank you." Not "I see what you did." Just damage control for Dale's feelings. I told myself that was just how my father showed appreciation. I'd been telling myself versions of that sentence since I was 9 years old. Over the next 6 years, the pattern repeated itself with the predictability of a tide chart. I'd quietly fix something Dale broke. My father would quietly make sure Dale never felt the consequences. And every year, at the company's anniversary dinner in March, my father would stand up, lift his glass, and say the exact same toast, to family and to the future of this company, which is in good hands. He always looked at Dale when he said good hands, never at me. I poured the wine those nights. I also, by then, controlled 40% of accounts payable approval and held signing authority on 2 of the company's 3 operating accounts. Nobody toasted that. The man who noticed was Walter. "He's going to hand that whole company to Dale someday, and Dale is going to run it into the ground inside 3 years, Walter told me, the autumn I turned 31. We were on his porch again, same chairs, same chipped paint on the railing that neither of us had ever bothered to fix. "You know that, don't you?" "I know it," I said. "So what are you going to do about it?" I didn't have an answer yet, but that conversation planted something in me that didn't fully bloom for another 3 years. Not anger. I want to be precise about that, because anger was never really the engine here. It was something steadier, a kind of attention. I started keeping my own files at home, separate from the company's official records, copies of every contract I signed, every wire transfer I authorized, every email where I'd made a decision on the company's behalf because my father was too busy or didn't want to deal with it. I dated everything, I kept it organized by year, then by category, then alphabetically within category, the way you'd expect from someone who'd spent 15 years as an accountant and had absolutely no intention of being caught flat-footed by anyone, least of all her own family. By 2021, I wasn't just the controller. I'd been quietly buying into the company for 4 years, starting with a small employee stock arrangement my father's attorney had set up back in 2017. Mostly as a tax strategy, he barely understood and definitely didn't think through. 11%, then 19%, then 26%. Each purchase was modest. $8,000 one year, $14,500 the next. Money I funneled from my own consulting work on the side, work I did at night, and on weekends precisely, so my father would never ask where it came from. By the start of 2024, I held 31% of Whitfield casework. My father held 55%. Dale, who had never put a single dollar of his own money into the business, held the remaining 14%, gifted to him outright by my father in 2019, to give him a stake in his future, my father had said at the time. Nobody gave me a stake. I bought mine, one quiet wire transfer at a time, for 7 years. I told no one except my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Margaret Hale, who had handled my CPA firm's corporate filings for a decade and had become, somewhere along the way, the only person besides Walter who fully understood what I was building and why. Margaret kept every stock purchase agreement filed and notarized. Everyone. 31 separate purchase tranches over 7 years, each one properly executed, each one sitting in a fireproof box in her office, not mine, because Margaret had insisted on that detail specifically. Your father can search your house if he ever gets suspicious, she told me once. He can't search mine. The betrayal that finally broke things open happened on a Tuesday in February 2024. My father called a family meeting, which in our house had always meant Dale wanted something and needed backup. I drove the 40 minutes from my place to the house I grew up in, parked in the same spot I'd parked in for 15 years, and walked into a kitchen that smelled the same way it always had: lemon polish, faint pipe tobacco, even though my father had quit smoking a decade earlier, like the smell had just decided to stay. My father told me Dale was getting married in June, to a woman named Brittany, who I'd met exactly twice, and that as a wedding gift, he wanted to give Dale controlling interest in Whitfield casework. To do that cleanly, without diluting Dale's new shares below a majority, my father needed me to sign over a portion of my own holding, specifically 18% of my 31 dossiers back to the company, to be reissued to Dale. I asked him calmly why he was asking me to give up shares I had purchased with my own money over 7 years, to subsidize a wedding gift for a man who had never invested a single dollar in the company he was about to control. My father's jaw tightened. It's not about the money, Paige. It's about keeping this in the family the right way. I am the family, I said. I'm also 31% of the cap table. He looked at me like I'd said something faintly embarrassing, like I'd shown up to church in pajamas. You've always been so transactional about this. It's not a business. It's our name on the building. I want you to notice something here, because it matters. My father had just asked me to hand over roughly $340,000 in equity at the company's last internal valuation, for free, to a man who had contributed nothing, and he was framing my hesitation, my simple, reasonable hesitation, as the emotional failure. That's the move villains make. They take the thing they're doing and hang it around your neck instead. I told him I needed to think about it. He told me I had until the engagement party, 6 weeks out, to do the right thing. Then he stood up, which in our house had always meant the conversation was over whether you were finished or not, and he said, "I raised you better than this." 11 words. I remember counting them on the drive home, the way you count something to keep yourself steady. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something, because I think most of you already know the answer in your own life. Have you ever been asked to give up something you built with your own hands, your own money, your own years, and been told that wanting to keep it made you the difficult one? Tell me in the comments. I read all of them, and I think you'll find you're not as alone in this as you feel right now. If this story is hitting close to home, hit subscribe now, because what happens next is the part people message me about for weeks. I didn't argue with my father again after that kitchen conversation. I went home, I poured a glass of water, no ice, and I called Margaret. "He wants 18%, I told her, for free, as a wedding gift to Dale." There was a pause on the line. 4 seconds. I counted, the way I'd started counting things by then, because numbers were the one thing in my life that never lied to me. "Paige," she finally said, "your father can't compel you to sell shares you own outright, not without your consent, and not without violating at least 2 provisions of the shareholder agreement he signed himself in 2017, when he set up your original allocation. He just doesn't remember what he signed." That was the moment the floor under me changed shape, although I didn't fully understand why yet. I asked Margaret to pull the original 2017 agreement, the one that had been drafted as a simple tax structuring document, in my father's own words, back when none of us thought it would ever matter, beyond a line item on a return. It took her 6 days to get everything together. 6 days during which I went to work, ran payroll, approved invoices, and sat across the table from my father at the Maple Fork on a Thursday, eating eggs I didn't taste, while he talked about Brittany's seating chart like nothing had happened. He'd already started rewriting the conversation in his head. I could tell. "You know I've always trusted you with the real responsibility here," he said, apropos of nothing, halfway through his coffee. He had never once, in 15 years, said the word trust to me about that company. Now, suddenly, with 18% of my equity on the table, I was the trusted one. People do that. They rewrite the history right in front of you, and they expect you to be too polite, or too tired, to call it what it is. On day 6, Margaret sent me a single PDF, 14 pages, and a 2-line email. "Read page 9 first, then call me." Page 9 was the voting rights clause. In 2017, in an arrangement designed purely to minimize my father's tax exposure on a transfer of founder shares, his own attorney at the time, not Margaret, a different, far less careful man named Schiff, who'd since retired to Florida, had structured my incoming equity not as common shares, but as a separate class, Class B shares, with a 4-to-1 voting multiplier, to preserve founder-level influence during the transition period, whatever that had meant to Schiff at the time. My father had signed it without reading it closely, the way he signed most things, trusting that whatever Schiff drew up was fine, because Schiff had a law degree, and my father did not. 31% of the company, held in Class B shares, with a 4-to-1 multiplier, meant I did not hold 31% of the voting power. I held 58%. I read that number 4 times before it settled into my chest, the way a fact settles when it's true, rather than wished for. My father believed, and had believed for 7 years, that he held majority control with his 55%. He had never once asked Margaret, or anyone, to actually run the voting math, because the assumption that he was in charge was so old and so comfortable that it had never occurred to him to check it. I had owned the company, in every way that the law recognized, since the year I turned 28 years old. I just hadn't known it either, not specifically, not with a number attached, until a Tuesday in March, 6 days after a kitchen conversation about a wedding gift that was never my father's to give. I sat with that fact for 2 full days before I told anyone but Margaret. Not because I was plotting something theatrical, because I needed to be sure I understood exactly what I had, the way you'd want to be sure of a diagnosis before you told your family about it. Margaret and I met twice more that week, once for 90 minutes, once for just under 2 hours, confirming every signature, every filing, every amendment on record with the state. 31 stock purchase agreements, 1 voting rights clause, nobody but a forgotten Florida attorney had ever fully understood. 0 ambiguity, once you actually did the arithmetic. I made 1 phone call after that, to Walter. He doesn't know, I told my grandfather, sitting in my car outside his house, because I hadn't been able to wait until I got to the porch. He thinks he's running the company. He's been wrong about that since 2017. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, once, a short, dry sound. $11,000, he said. That's what I lent him in 1981 to buy his first table saw. You know what he told me when he paid me back. He said, "I built this myself, Dad." He's been saying some version of that sentence his whole life. Funny how it's never quite true. I asked Walter not to say anything yet. He told me he wouldn't, and I believed him, because in 34 years he had never once given me a reason not to. The engagement party was 5 weeks out. I didn't sign anything. I didn't argue either. I went to work every day, approved the same invoices, ran the same payroll, smiled at the same Thursday breakfast at the Maple Fork, and let my father believe, for 5 more weeks, that he was negotiating with someone who had no leverage at all. I want to be honest with you about why I waited. It wasn't strategy for strategy's sake. I wanted him to make his choice freely, without me holding a number over his head, because some part of me, the part that was still 9 years old, still grieving a mother, and clinging to whatever was left of a family, wanted him to do the right thing simply because it was right. I gave him 5 weeks to be the father I'd always hoped he was. He used every one of those weeks to tell 3 separate relatives, including an aunt I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, that I was being difficult about the company, and that he hoped I'd come around before the wedding. He never once mentioned that what he was asking me to give up was worth $340,000. He never mentioned that it was mine. He just told people I was being difficult, the easiest word in the English language for describing a woman who says no. The engagement party was held at the Cedar Hollow Grange Hall, the same building where my own confirmation reception had been held 20 years earlier. The same folding chairs, the same smell of church basement coffee and floor wax. My father had invited about 60 people. Brittany's family had driven up from Columbus. Dale wore a new suit he definitely hadn't paid for himself. My father cornered me by the drinks table at 7:40 in the evening, 40 minutes into the party, 3 days before his original deadline. "I need an answer tonight," he said, low enough that no one else could hear, but his jaw was already tight, already moving in that small, repetitive way it did when he was building towards something. "Brittany's family is asking questions about the business. I told them Dale would have controlling interest by summer. Don't make me look like a liar in front of these people, Paige." I had brought a single folder with me, manila, unmarked, thin enough that nobody glancing at my bag would have thought twice about it. I'd debated bringing it at all. Some version of me, even that night, wanted to give him one more chance to simply say yes to fairness without needing to see paper. But I'd learned, over 34 years, that hope is not a strategy. And I am, if nothing else, someone who plans for the version of events that actually tends to happen. I have an answer, I said, but I think we should step into the side room. You won't want an audience for this. He laughed, short and performative, the kind of laugh meant for anyone within earshot. An audience for what? You signing some papers? You should still come to the side room, I said. He came, mostly, I think, because he assumed he'd already won and wanted to enjoy it privately before going back out to tell everyone. Dale followed us in, uninvited, already smirking. Margaret was waiting inside. My father's face did something small and confused when he saw her. A flicker, gone in under 2 seconds. The first crack in an evening he thought he already understood completely. Margaret's just here as a witness, I said, in case anyone has questions later about what was said. I opened the folder. Inside were 4 documents. The 2017 shareholder agreement, with Schiff's signature, and my father's signature, both visible on page 11. A current capitalization table, dated that week, showing every shareholder's economic and voting interest side by side. A 1-page memo from Margaret, plain language, no jargon, explaining the voting multiplier in 3 sentences anyone could understand. And a printed email, the one my father had sent in 2019 gifting Dale his 14%, to give him a stake in his future. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid the capitalization table on the table between us, turned it so it faced him, and said, "I'm not signing anything tonight, Dad. I want you to look at this number first." His eyes moved down the page. I watched his face the way I'd watched it my whole life, looking for some flicker of the man who used to lift me onto his shoulders at the 4th of July parade, before grief and Dale, and 40 years of being the only voice in every room had hardened something in him. What I saw instead was his jaw working once, twice, and then going completely still. His eyes stopped on the voting power column. 58%. Then they moved to my name next to it. Then they moved to his own line. 55% economic interest. Voting power. 22%. And something behind his eyes went flat. The particular flatness of a man doing math he should have done 7 years earlier. The room was quiet for 9 seconds. I counted. "This isn't right," he finally said, but his voice had lost the volume it walked in with. Schiff wouldn't have. "Schiff did," Margaret said, calm, even, sliding the original signed agreement 2 inches closer to him. "Your signature is on page 11. You signed it on October 4th, 2017. Dale, who had been smirking by the doorway, stepped forward and reached for the capitalization table, like he could somehow argue with arithmetic by reading it faster. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said, his voice climbing in the specific way Dale's voice always climbed when reality stopped cooperating with him. "Dad, tell her this is a mistake." My father didn't say anything. That was the moment his performance, the one he'd been running my whole life. The booming father, the man whose word was the only word that mattered in that house, simply ran out of material. You cannot perform certainty at a number. The paper doesn't applaud, doesn't flinch, doesn't rewrite itself to make you comfortable. It just sits there, being true, the same way it had been true for 7 years, while nobody bothered to check it. That's when the side room door opened again, and Walter walked in. Nobody had told him to come. I found out later that he'd simply driven himself the 11 miles from his house, because he said he had a feeling about tonight. the way old men sometimes do about things they've quietly been watching unfold for years. He didn't say a word when he stepped inside. He looked at my father first. Just looked for 3 long seconds. The kind of look that carries 40 years of watching someone build a company on someone else's first loan and someone else's daily, invisible labor. Then he walked, slowly, past Dale, past my father, and stood beside me. He reached into his coat pocket and set a single folded piece of paper on the table next to the capitalization table. It was the original handwritten ledger entry from 1981, the $11,000 loan, in his own faded handwriting, the ink gone, the soft brown of something that had survived 4 decades in a drawer. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. He put his hand on my shoulder, just once, just briefly, the weight of it warm and certain, and he looked at my father and said nothing at all. The silence did more than any sentence could have. My father looked at that old piece of paper, then at his own father's hand resting on my shoulder instead of his, and something in his face finally, fully broke. Not into anger, but into something quieter and harder to watch. Recognition, maybe, or just the particular grief of realizing, decades too late, that you mistook the wrong person for the foundation of everything you built. Nobody spoke for 11 seconds. I counted those too. Out in the main hall, through the closed door, I could hear someone's laughter, glasses clinking, a song playing low on a speaker, the ordinary sounds of a party that had no idea what was happening 40 feet away in a room with folding chairs and a folder full of paper. I didn't take the company from my father that night. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are waiting for the part where I walk in and fire everyone and lock the doors. That's not what happened, and honestly, it's not who I am. What happened is quieter than that. I told my father I had no intention of dissolving anything, removing him from his role, or embarrassing him publicly. I told him the truth, that I had built my position the same way he'd built his, slowly, with my own money, over years he hadn't been paying attention to. I told him Dale could still have a future at the company, a real one, if he wanted to actually learn the business instead of being given pieces of it. I told him none of this needed to leave that room unless he chose to make it leave that room. My father didn't apologize. Not that night, and not in the 11 weeks since. What he did was go quiet. A different quiet than his usual silence. Something heavier. Something that sat on him differently at dinner, at the shop, at the few family gatherings we've managed since. He started asking Margaret questions directly, instead of routing everything through assumption. Small thing. It cost him nothing to do it 7 years ago, and he never thought to. He still hasn't said the word sorry. I've stopped waiting for it. Dale, to his very small credit, came to my office 3 weeks later, alone, and asked if I'd actually teach him the parts of the business he never bothered to learn. I said yes. I don't know yet if it will stick. But it was the first time in 34 years my brother had asked me for something, instead of simply expecting it. And I noticed that, the way you notice the first crack of light under a door that's been shut a long time. I lost something that night too, even though I walked out with everything legally mine. I lost the last version of the story, where my father was simply a hard man, who loved imperfectly, but loved completely. I don't get to believe that one anymore. What I have instead is a clearer, harder truth, that I built something real, that the numbers never once lied to me even when people did, and that the company my father always called his was, for 7 quiet years, also fully and legally mine, whether he saw it or not. I drove home from the Grange Hall a little after 10 that night. I didn't slam my front door when I got home. I just closed it, gently, the way you close a door on a room you don't need to walk back into anymore. The sound was small. It was enough. If there's one thing 34 years and a folder full of paper taught me, it's this. You don't need to raise your voice to be taken seriously, and you don't need anyone's permission to know the value of what you've built. The people who call you difficult for protecting yourself are usually the same people who benefited, quietly, for years, from you never doing it sooner. I had every right to walk into that Grange Hall and make my father's life very small. I chose instead to let him keep his dignity, because peace, it turns out, is worth more to me than watching someone lose everything in front of a room full of folding chairs. So let me ask you, if you found out tomorrow that you'd had the power all along, what would you actually do with it? Tell me below. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, because someone in your life probably does. Subscribe to Home of Secrets if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.